The date is February 26th, 2022. Outside the headquarters of the European Council in Brussels, the air is sharp, quiet, expectant. Police barriers line the streets. Cameras wait on tripods. Journalists murmur in low voices, rehearsing phrases they do not yet fully understand. Inside, behind closed doors, a small group of officials is preparing to activate a financial switch that has never been used at this scale in modern history. On their screens, one name appears again and again: SWIFT. To most citizens, it is just another acronym buried in the background of the financial system. To the people in this room, it is something else entirely. It is the nervous system of global money. 11,000 banks in over 200 countries, trillions of dollars in transactions every single day, all pulsing through a secure network of messages that rarely makes headlines and never appears on a ballot. For half a century, it has been treated as plumbing, invisible but indispensable. Today, it is being turned into a weapon. The announcement is drafted in neutral language. Phrases like targeted sanctions and financial restrictions soften what is, in effect, an act of economic warfare against the world's 11th largest economy. Russian banks will be disconnected from SWIFT. Their messages will not be delivered. Their payment instructions will not be recognized. For oil exporters, importers of machinery, grain traders, insurers, ship owners, the implications are immediate and brutal. Without the messaging, the money cannot move. Without the money, trade stops. In Washington, this move is framed as the nuclear option of sanctions. The logic appears simple. Cut Russia off from the financial bloodstream, and the body will collapse. The ruble will crash. Banks will fail. Ordinary citizens, unable to withdraw savings or pay bills, will turn against their government. Faced with economic ruin and political unrest, the Kremlin will be forced either to retreat from Ukraine or confront a crisis at home that threatens its survival. For a few days, it looks as if that prediction will come true. The ruble plunges. The Moscow Stock Exchange shuts down to avoid a full-scale crash. Western commentators speak with certainty. They say Russia has been cut off from the global economy. They say the sanctions will cripple its financial system. But while the cameras focus on scenes of panic in Moscow, something else is happening in silence, far from television studios and press conferences. In Beijing, in New Delhi, in Riyadh, in Brasilia, officials watch the same decision and draw a very different conclusion. They are not asking whether Russia can survive without SWIFT. They are asking a colder, more existential question. If the United States and its allies can do this to Russia, what could they do to us? For decades, the global financial system has been presented as a neutral infrastructure. The dollar was described as a reserve currency, SWIFT as a messaging platform, sanctions as a measure of last resort. On that February day, the illusion begins to crack. A precedent is set in real time. Central bank reserves can be frozen. Banks can be excluded. A country that holds hundreds of billions of dollars in Western institutions can wake up and find that those assets no longer move on command. History has already written the script for what happens when a dominant power turns its financial infrastructure into an instrument of coercion. In the early 20th century, the British Empire seized enemy assets across its territories, believing this would reinforce London's control over global capital. Later, the United States froze Iranian assets, and decades after that, began sanctioning Russia over Crimea, giving Moscow years to quietly redesign its financial circuitry. Each time, the pattern was the same. The dominant power believed it was exercising ultimate leverage. In reality, it was teaching the world a lesson: money held under someone else. Jurisdiction is never fully yours. Assets can be seized, access can be revoked, systems can be weaponized, and once that lesson is understood, the rest of the world does not protest loudly. It prepares quietly. By the time Russia is cut off from SWIFT in 2022, that preparation has already begun. Moscow has reduced its holdings of US treasuries to almost nothing. It has increased its gold reserves, It has built a domestic financial messaging system. It has negotiated trade agreements that allow settlement in rubles, yuan, and rupees instead of dollars and euros. None of these measures can fully offset the shock of sanctions, but together they form a rudimentary lifeboat. When the torpedo hits, the ship is damaged, but it does not sink. What began as an attempt to isolate one country becomes something else, a signal to much of the world that the age of unquestioned dollar dominance is ending. The weapon that was meant to enforce the system has started to undermine it. The very act of demonstrating that SWIFT and the dollar can be used against a major power has pushed dozens of other nations to ensure they are never trapped in the same way. To understand what happens next, and why the decision taken in Brussels and Washington on that February day may be remembered as the beginning of the end of American financial hegemony, we have to step back. We have to look at the 4 historical precedents that define this pattern. We have to examine the 5 stages through which every financial weapon passes, from dominance to self-destruction. And we have to follow the data that shows, with uncomfortable clarity, that the same pattern is unfolding again, this time around SWIFT and the dollar. This is the story of how a single decision, made in the name of punishment and deterrence, triggered a global search for alternatives. It is the story of how a system built on trust revealed itself as a system built on conditional permission. And it is the story of how that revelation set a 20-year countdown on the world's most powerful currency. The pattern begins long before anyone has heard of SWIFT. It begins in an era of steamships and telegraph cables, when the city of London is the unquestioned capital of global finance and the British pound is as good as gold. In the summer of 1914, as Europe slides toward war, London's banks hum with ordinary business. German companies finance trade through British institutions. Insurance contracts are written in London, paid in Hamburg, enforced in Antwerp and Bombay. The assumption is universal and unspoken. Whatever armies may do on land and sea, money will remain neutral. Then war is declared, and for the first time, that assumption is shattered. In August 1914, the British government passes the Trading with the Enemy Act. On paper, it is simply a legal framework, a way to prevent funds from aiding an adversary. In practice, it is a momentous crossing of a line that had held for centuries. British authorities begin freezing German assets, seizing ships, interrupting payments, dismantling commercial networks that had taken decades to build. Quietly, without cannon fire or infantry charges, the financial lifelines of German business are cut. In Berlin, the impact is immediate. Manufacturers that once relied on British credit lines find those lines severed overnight. Exporters discover that cargoes insured in London can no longer be paid out. Bankers, who once treated London as the safe, apolitical center of global finance, recognize that the rules have changed. The empire is not only a military power, it is a gatekeeper of capital. And it has just proven that it will use that position against its enemies. But the more important reaction does not take place in Berlin. It unfolds in the offices of neutral powers in New York, in Amsterdam, in the capitals of South America and Asia. Central bankers and finance ministers watch Britain seize German assets and ask themselves a quiet, unnerving question. If London can do this to Germany today, what guarantees that it will not do something similar to us tomorrow, in some future conflict that has nothing to do with us? Step by step, they begin to respond in the only way that matters in finance. They move their money. Gold reserves, which had once flowed naturally to London, begin to be stored elsewhere. New York banks, previously junior partners in the global system, start to attract deposits that might once have crossed the Atlantic. Slowly, the gravitational pull of London finance weakens. No single transaction announces the shift. No headline declares the decline. But over 3 decades, the consequences become impossible to ignore. By 1944, at Bretton Woods, the British pound is no longer the axis of the global monetary order. The world's delegates do not gather in an English seaside resort. They gather in the United States to formalize a new reality. The dollar has replaced sterling as the world's reserve currency. The fall did not happen in one night. It began the moment Britain proved that its financial system was not neutral. Decades later, the United States would face the same temptation and make the same choice. The year is 1979. In Tehran, revolutionary students storm the American embassy and seize dozens of hostages. Images of blindfolded diplomats and burning flags flash across television screens in the United States. The response from Washington is swift and severe. President Jimmy Carter announces that all Iranian assets held in American banks will be frozen. Roughly $12 billion in deposits, securities, and other holdings are suddenly immobilized. From a domestic perspective, the move is popular, even obvious. The United States is punishing a regime that has violated international law and humiliated its diplomats. Freezing assets is framed as a measured alternative to military escalation. But outside America, particularly in the oil-rich states of the Middle East, the symbolism is alarming. Leaders in Riyadh, Kuwait City, and Abu Dhabi, who have quietly accumulated large dollar reserves in New York, recognize that these reserves are not untouchable after all. They exist at the pleasure of the U.S. government. A signature in Washington can make them inaccessible. In private meetings, finance ministers and central bank governors begin to ask their own version of the same question that haunted neutral powers in 1914. If the United States can freeze Iran's reserves today, what stops it from freezing ours in some future dispute? What if a political disagreement, a diplomatic clash, or a shift in foreign policy turns our assets into leverage? The response is again subtle, gradual, but relentless. The share of reserves held exclusively in dollars begins to fall. Alternative currencies, Deutsche Marks, yen, Swiss francs, gain ground. Gold purchases resume on a scale not seen in years. London, Zurich, Singapore, and other financial centers attract deposits that might once have remained in New York. Official communiques speak of diversification, a word that sounds technical but conceals a profound loss of trust. The Iranian asset freeze achieves its immediate objective. The hostages are eventually released. The United States demonstrates that it can impose devastating financial costs without firing a shot. Yet, like Britain before it, America also demonstrates something else, that its financial system can be turned into an instrument of state power. Every country that notices that fact files it away, and in the decades that follow, they quietly act on it. By the time Russia annexes Crimea in 2014, the pattern is already familiar, even if it is rarely named aloud. Once again, the United States reaches for financial tools, sanctions on officials, limitations on banks, restrictions on capital flows. Once again, the target is pressured. But this time, something important is different. Russia is not an isolated revolutionary state. It is a major energy exporter with deep links to Europe and Asia. Its leadership has watched the Iranian case, studied the British precedent, and drawn its own conclusions. Inside the Kremlin, the question is no longer whether the United States will use financial power against Russia. That question has been answered. The only question is when and how severe the blow will be, so Moscow begins to prepare. Over the next 8 years, Russia reduces its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds to almost nothing. It accumulates thousands of tons of gold. It develops SPFS, its own financial messaging system designed as a domestic backup if SWIFT ever becomes unavailable. It negotiates with China and India to settle trade in local currencies. It adjusts its banking system to survive a world in which dollars cannot be relied upon. To Western observers, these moves often look symbolic, even performative. Analysts speak of limited impact and assume that a country so integrated into global markets cannot truly operate outside them. But to Russia's policymakers, these steps are not about comfort. They are about survival. And so when the decision of February 2022 finally arrives, when the United States, the European Union, and their allies decide to cut major Russian banks off from SWIFT and freeze hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian reserves, the shock is real, but it is not total. The blow lands on a system that has spent years hardening itself. Britain in 1914, the United States in 1979, Russia's gradual decoupling after 2014. Taken together, these episodes reveal a simple but unforgiving law of financial power. The moment a dominant system proves it can be used as a weapon, the rest of the world begins, quietly, methodically, to reduce its dependence on that system. The process takes years, sometimes decades. It is almost invisible until it is almost complete. But once it has advanced far enough, reversal becomes impossible. By 2022, the United States controls not only the world's primary reserve currency, but also the most important messaging network in global finance. By using both against Russia at once, it believes it is demonstrating unmatched leverage. In reality, it is completing the pattern that began more than a century earlier in London, turning a position of absolute dominance into the starting point of long-term decline. Billions of dollars moved through lines of text with no global standard. The risk was obvious. It is the nervous system of the global economy, firing signals no one outside the industry notices. Those banks are under U.S. jurisdiction. The Treasury Department can sanction them. None of these decisions is dramatic on its own. A swap line here, a yuan-denominated oil contract there, a small increase in gold reserves, a modest reduction in U.S. Treasury holdings. But each one is a vote in the same direction, less dependence on a system that has proven it can be turned against you. The process follows a 5-stage pattern, one that has repeated across the last century with unsettling regularity. First, a dominant power gains control over the central infrastructure of global finance. For Britain, in the early 20th century, that infrastructure was sterling-based trade credit and London's banking system. For the United States, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it is the dollar and the network of institutions that clear it, New York banks, and the SWIFT messages that connect them. Control brings privileges, the ability to run deficits cheaply, to borrow in one's own currency, to influence global liquidity and monetary conditions far beyond national borders. Second, that power begins to weaponize the system for foreign policy. At first, the targets are narrow and widely accepted: terrorists, rogue regimes, clear violators of international norms. Over time, the scope expands. Asset freezes and sanctions become a standard instrument of policy. Each success makes the tool more attractive, more normal, more tempting to use again. Eventually, the temptation becomes irresistible in a major geopolitical confrontation. Cutting a rival off from the financial system appears to offer the prospect of victory without war. Third, the targets of that weaponization seek alternatives. At the beginning, those alternatives are inefficient, costly, partial. They involve barter, gold, local currency arrangements, experimental systems with limited capacity. They are dismissed as symbolic gestures by analysts within the dominant system. But for the targets, symbolism is not the point. The point is to survive the moment when access is revoked, and every step toward autonomy, however incremental, makes survival more likely. Fourth, neutral countries hedge. They are not under attack. They have not been sanctioned, but they can see how the tool is used, and they can imagine scenarios in which they might find themselves on the wrong side of future disputes. They do not necessarily oppose the dominant power. Many of them are allies. Yet their duty is to their own sovereignty, not to the financial comfort of another state. So they begin to diversify reserves, explore alternative payment systems, and sign agreements that allow trade to settle outside the dominant currency. They rarely announce these moves as acts of defiance. They describe them as prudent risk management. That does not make them any less significant. Finally, the weapon loses power. It does not stop functioning, but it ceases to be decisive. The first time it is used on a major target, it causes shock and disruption. The second time, it encounters prepared defenses. The third time, the threat of its use no longer inspires the same fear, because the architecture of alternatives has matured. What was once a monopoly has become one option among many. The dominant power can still inflict pain, but it can no longer dictate outcomes. This is where the dollar and SWIFT find themselves now. The United States still issues the largest reserve currency. SWIFT still carries the majority of cross-border financial messages. But their trajectory has changed. The dollar's share of global reserves has been drifting downward for years. In the last decade, that drift has become a slide. Trade invoicing in alternative currencies is rising. Gold purchases by central banks are at multi-decade highs. SIPs and other systems are posting double-digit growth in volume, off a smaller base, but from a position that did not exist a short time ago. The numbers are debated, the exact pace is uncertain, but the direction is unmistakable. The implications for the United States are profound. For decades, dollar dominance has funded a way of life. Foreign central banks and investors buy U.S. Treasury bonds not just because they want American debt, but because they need dollar assets. Those purchases keep interest rates lower than they would otherwise be. They make it possible for the US government to run chronic deficits without immediate crisis. They support a model in which the United States consumes more than it produces, importing goods and exporting pieces of paper and digital claims in return. If the dollar's share of reserves and trade settlement falls far enough, that model begins to break. Foreign demand for treasuries weakens, the cost of borrowing rises, the freedom to finance everything, from social programs to military deployments, by issuing more debt erodes. To maintain living standards at home and influence abroad, the United States would need to do something it has not been forced to do in generations: live within its means. The shift will not happen overnight. There will be no single day when the dollar collapses in the way sensational headlines sometimes suggest. Reserve compositions change gradually, contracts roll off and are rewritten. Systems like CIPS expand transaction by transaction, not by decree. But over 15 or 20 years, those increments add up. A world in which the dollar accounts for 35 or 40% of reserves rather than 60 or 70 is a fundamentally different world from the one that defined the late 20th century. In that world, China is the primary beneficiary. It does not need to replace the dollar entirely to gain strategic advantage. It simply needs to offer a credible alternative. As trade with China is increasingly settled in yuan, as more central banks hold yuan-denominated assets, and as systems like CIPS deepen their reach, Beijing gains many of the quiet privileges Washington once enjoyed. It can extend credit in its own currency. It can deepen dependency through finance, not just through manufacturing and trade. And it can do all of this while watching the United States struggle with the consequences of choices made years earlier. Russia, though much smaller economically, gains something more subtle but equally important: proof of concept. By surviving the swift cutoff and the freezing of its reserves, it demonstrates to others that there is life outside the dollar-centric system. The price is high: recession, inflation, capital flight, but survival itself is the message. If a heavily sanctioned state can reorient trade toward China, India, and the Middle East, and stabilize its currency after an initial crash, then the threat of financial annihilation from Washington no longer looks absolute. Middle powers and emerging economies gain leverage as well. Countries like India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, South Africa, and others find themselves courted by multiple financial blocs. They can negotiate better terms, demand more balanced relationships, and resist pressure to align unconditionally with one camp. A multipolar currency world is more complex, less efficient, and often more unstable. But for those in between the great powers, it offers room to maneuver that did not exist when a single currency sat at the center of everything. For Europe, the picture is more ambiguous. The euro has the scale and institutional backing to serve as a genuine alternative reserve asset. Yet the continent's strategic alignment with the United States, especially in the wake of the Ukraine war, ties it closely to the very system that is losing its monopoly. By joining sanctions, freezing Russian reserves, and supporting the swift cutoff, European states signaled their willingness to use financial power in concert with Washington. In doing so, they also signaled to the rest of the world that the euro-based system is not fully independent of US policy. The long-term result may be an uncomfortable position, too bound to America to be a neutral safe haven, too economically constrained to rival China's rise. SWIFT itself undergoes a quieter transformation. It does not vanish. Banks still rely on it, but it is no longer the only crucial highway for financial messages. Other roads exist, some paved by states, others by technology companies and decentralized networks. Every transaction routed through those alternatives is one less data point under Western oversight, one less dependency that can be leveraged. The power of exclusion, the ability to disconnect a country, and watch its economy implode, diminishes with each percentage point of volume that migrates away. Looking back, historians will likely mark February 2022 not as the moment when financial sanctions reached their greatest triumph, but as the moment when their strategic effectiveness began to decay. The decision to cut Russia off from SWIFT and freeze its reserves will be seen as the culmination of a long tradition, stretching from London in 1914 through Washington in 1979 and 2014. The belief that control over the world AS money can be used to enforce political outcomes. What those historians will also record is that the same decision accelerated the search for escape routes. Central banks bought gold because it cannot be frozen with a signature. Governments negotiated swap lines and alternative systems because a crisis has no sympathy for countries that relied on trust alone. Financial engineers built new rails for payments because it is no longer acceptable to place all of the world's transactions on infrastructure vulnerable to a single state or policy choices. In the end, the story of SWIFT and the dollar is not just about sanctions or geopolitics. It is about the limits of power. A system can be so dominant that it appears unassailable. Yet if that system is used too aggressively, it begins to undermine its own foundations. The more often financial weapons are deployed, the more urgently the rest of the world works to neutralize them. Eventually, the weapon is still there. Faced with that reality, nations did what rational actors always do. They adapted. The countdown has already started. The exact year when the dollar ceases to be the unquestioned center of global finance is uncertain. What is certain is that the trigger has been pulled. Financial weapons are never truly one-sided. They wound the target. But over time, they corrode the hand that wields them. The day will come when a future historian writes about the early 21st century and tries to identify the moment when American monetary supremacy began to erode irreversibly. They will not point to a market crash or a formal declaration. They will point to a winter day in 2022 when a group of officials convinced they were demonstrating strength quietly set in motion the search for a world beyond SWIFT, beyond the dollar, beyond the reach of one country's sanctions. And they will note that the rest of the world heard the message clearly: never be dependent enough to be cut off again.